if you desire to spread plague and pestilence upon your foes, then this is probably a good build for you. Hi everyone, welcome back. I've got another build video for you today. I'm going to be showing you my Diseased Dancer build. This build uses poison, scarlet rot, and a little bit of bleed in order to burn your foes down and also raise your attack power so you can get quick, hard-hitting attacks out with thrusting swords. You can start playing this build around the time that you beat Radon, because a lot of the equipment you need you get around that time. Here's my stat spread at level 117. You're going to want a decent amount of vigor because you are fighting up close to the enemy and you will be taking some hits. You only need about 12 mind because we're not casting a ton of spells. Endurance I have at 19 because that's exactly what I need in order to medium roll with my equipment. You only need 11 strength to wield your weapons, 15 dexterity, and then you don't need any intelligence. You only need 15 faith, and arcane is where we're going to be stacking points for damage. Also, it's important to note that you do need 20 dexterity, but because I'm using Millicent's prosthesis, I only spec'd into 15 points. For my Wondrous Physic, I put in the Opaline Hard tier and the Green Spill Crystal tier, which I later upgrade to the Thorny Crack tier once it's available to you. For our spells, we want the Scarlet Rot Breath, the Pest Threads, Swarm of Flies, and Poison Mist. For our two main thrusting swords that we're going to be using, I got the Clean Rot Knight swords. For my second main hand weapon, I have the Antspur Rapier. And then the seal we're using to cast all of our incantations, I'm using the Dragon Communion seal because we're putting most of our points into Arcane, and that's where we're going to be getting our scaling from with that seal. I set all of my weapons to the Occult Affinity because that's going to maximize my physical damage when I'm speccing into Arcane. And for my armor, I use the Mushroom Crown. We use this because it gives us a good damage bonus when we either inflict Scarlet Rot or Poison. And then the rest of the armor, I use the Eccentric set because it provides a decent amount of protection, and also it just looks good with the mushroom / pestilence theme. And our talismans, I'm using the Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, and the Kindred of Rot Talisman. You can replace the Winged Sword Insignia with the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia when you have access to it. On your first playthrough, I recommend you get Millicent's Prosthesis instead because it's going to give you that 5 dexterity that we need to meet the requirements for our Antspur Rapier. For the fourth talisman slot, you have a couple of options. You can go with the Spear Talisman. This raises the amount of damage you do when you attack the enemy while they're attacking you. This one I find is more useful for bosses, so I don't use it all that much because most of the time you're going to want to dodge the enemy's attack rather than trade with them. Another option would be Alexander's Jar Shard if you're relying on your weapon arts for a lot of your damage output. And then the other option is to go with one of the Dragon Crest talismans to mitigate the damage that you take. The Ash of War we're using on our offhand sword is the Poison Mist. Typically, before I run into a battle where I want to poison the enemy, I will use this, which coats the weapon in poison and allows you to set it pretty quickly. And on our main hand Clean Rot Knight sword, I'm using Poison Mothflight. This will either poison the enemy if they're not already poisoned, or if they are poisoned, it removes the poison and deals a good chunk of damage. Once you get good at timing this attack, you'll find that it's extremely useful at dealing high amounts of damage, especially if you've got off a lot of attacks recently and stacked your attack rating with Mushroom Crown, Kindred of Rot's Talisman, and your 2 talismans that increase your AR when you get successive attacks. Plus Alexander's Jar Shard if that's what you're using. And then the Ash of War on the Antspur Rapier. You have 2 options here, and it really depends on your playstyle. Your options are Bloody Slash, which deals a really good amount of damage. In fact, it out-damages Poison Mothflight in most cases. Or my personal favorite, Blood Tax. Blood Tax is useful because it's going to restore some of your health. Plus it deals a good amount of stance damage, so most enemies can't attack through it. And just using this twice nets you 8 hits on the enemy, which usually will set Scarlet Rot unless they're resistant or immune. I also played around with using seppuku, which you could use on certain fights where maybe the enemy is immune to poison and scarlet rot and you really want to be setting hemorrhage more often, but I didn't really use it that much, but it is an option. The main drawback to this build is when you're fighting enemies that are immune or resistant to poison and scarlet rot. And I will say there are a lot of enemies that you encounter that are immune to scarlet rot. I initially wanted to make a build that centered around the Ansper Rapier, but I had trouble making it effective because of this fact. So I ended up sort of pivoting and using poison as my main application, and then just scarlet rot in more situational circumstances. For enemies that you can apply the effect to, this build can do some insane numbers. The Kindred of Rot's Talisman will add 20% to your attack rating, the Mushroom Crown 10%. Between your Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prosthesis, you can get up to another 20%. And then if you're using weapon skills and you have Alexander's Jar Shard, that's another 15%. And your Clean Rot Knight Swords should have around 500 attack rating, unbuffed, around level 110. So between your two weapons, that's around 1,000 attack rating, and conservatively up to another 50% once you get your buffs going, which means you're running into enemies with 1,500 attack rating. I chose the Clean Rot Knight Sword here because they have the longest reach of any of the thrusting swords. Also, when you use the Occult Affinity, they end up having the highest attack rating of any thrusting sword. And our spells complement this build really well for when you need a little bit of a ranged attack, or if you have a large group of enemies that you need to burn down. For enemies that you aren't going to be able to set any status effects on, I recommend picking up the Cragblade Ash of War. When I fought Godfrey, I just two-handed one of my thrusting swords, and I put on Cragblade to increase the damage it does. I just kept dodging him, getting off attacks when I could in between his. And so I will say that this build is kind of annoying for fights like that. But this is why having the Occult Affinity is so important, because rather than focusing only on poison or only on scarlet rot, we also have a good amount of just raw physical attack damage from our thrusting swords. You can play this build a number of different ways. Typically, you'll use your poison or scarlet rot to set on an enemy and get a couple of attacks off to boost your attack rating, and then you should be able to just go and trade with enemies or dodge their attacks. Once you're buffed up, you should be able to mow down most enemies in no time. Another way to play is a little bit more sneaky. You can sneak up behind enemies, drop a poison mist, and it won't alert them that you're there, so you can run around and poison a bunch of enemies, and then once it's been set, you can just start taking them down, and the rest of them will be ticking away with poison. And of course, for large groups of enemies, I like to use the Rot Breath. This does really good AoE damage and can make quick work of foes, but because we don't have a lot of mind, you're not going to be using this a whole lot. For more aggressive enemies that are going to run into you, I like to send out a poison mist first so that they run into it, and then use blood tax when they're right in the middle of it. This will kind of stop them in their tracks so that they're sitting in the middle of the poison cloud. And if you can hit them with 2 blood taxes in a row, you will have set both poison and scarlet rot on them. And not that you'll need to, but if you want to, you can just run away from them and watch these 2 diseases just kill them. That's it for this build video. Please let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section. Got a few more plans, so they'll be coming out in the next couple weeks. Keep an eye out for those. Alright, see you next time.